Good morning. I'm Linda Ostovitz, and we just concluded our sort of kickoff for the fall season, if you will, of our breakfast bar series. And this morning I was thrilled to have my partner Ian with us to talk about, as you can see here, you bet, sports gambling in the Mid-Atlantic. And what is so interesting about this subject, it seems, is how it's evolving and how it's being legalized in certain areas and not in others. So since we are sitting in Howard County, Maryland, would you tell us what the status is of the legalization of gaming in Maryland?
Absolutely. So presently, sports gambling is not legal in Maryland. It has recently been legalized in the District of Columbia. But Maryland, it is actually presently unconstitutional to place sports wagers within this jurisdiction. It is talked about changing the Constitution to allow it. I think it will likely occur within the next couple of years, but it's going to require a ballot referendum within the state in order to get it there. I would say between 2021, 2022 would be a good estimate as to when sports gaming will be legal within Maryland.
And I think you shared with us this morning that there is a particular article within the Constitution that specifically says sports betting is illegal. Is that correct?
That's correct. It's Article 19 of the Maryland State Constitution. It is shockingly specific as to what it addresses and what type of gambling is legal in Maryland, because obviously you can gamble on slots and card games and horses within the state, but it is specific that sports wagering is not permitted.
So as of right now, who are we competing with locally who does have gaming?
Pretty much everyone that surrounds Maryland. So Delaware was the first state after the Supreme Court recently struck down the ban on sports gambling. Delaware was the first state to legalize. West Virginia followed soon thereafter, and D.C. as of August 30th issued their final regulations and has also legalized. So Maryland is essentially surrounded by jurisdictions that allow sports gambling, and Marylanders are probably going to be traveling outside the border to place their wagers on the Ravens, the Orioles, and every other sports team that they're interested in.
You talked about some numbers, some staggering numbers for the amount of revenue that is generated by gaming. So can you give us some idea of what kind of dollars are involved in gaming?
Absolutely. So in Nevada in 2018, $5 billion was placed on sports wagers alone. In the United States, it is estimated that $180 billion is gambled annually through either illegal local sports books or out of the country sports books. So there's obviously a lot of money that's being spent on sports wagering that may not be captured by jurisdictions that haven't legalized the practice.
So assuming that someday, sooner rather than later, we may have this legalized in Maryland, are there other industries that you would expect to develop around the gaming industry?
Absolutely. It's one of the things that I don't think people generally think about, but is something that's important to consider. With each of these states going live, there are other industries that have opportunities. For example, the food and beverage industry. At local sports books, people are going to want to serve food and beverages to their clients. There are audit and anti-money laundering issues that are going to be present at every single sports book. So accountants and forensic accounting teams are going to be very important, and opportunities are going to present themselves for them as well. Medical professionals are another example of an industry that absolutely will be involved as sports gambling goes live in jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For example, the District of Columbia, which has just legalized sports gambling, there is not a single clinician that is licensed to treat gambling addiction in that jurisdiction. So as the District of Columbia legalizes sports gambling, there is a huge niche practice area for medical professionals and clinicians to get involved in. And I imagine that will hold true for Maryland once it eventually legalizes sports gaming, and for other jurisdictions as well.
So you mentioned the term addiction, and we hear that in connection with, some other industries that have been legalized over time. I assume there's some some educational piece that's going to be involved with rolling out gaming, or has been involved with rolling out gaming in other jurisdictions. Is that true?
That's absolutely correct.
Mm-hmm.
So each jurisdiction that has legalized gaming, and DC is one that's near and dear to my heart, they require every person who applies for a license to put forth a responsible gaming plan. And what this does is it basically shows how the sports book is going to work to deal on the private side with issues that come from gambling, whether it's depression, gambling addiction, or other potential problems. It usually requires a commitment to fund certain educational materials, to provide educational materials, and to provide access to treatment if necessary. So there's there's a private side of dealing with sort of the pitfalls of legalized gambling. In addition, most of the jurisdictions that have legalized gaming also are taking money from the tax revenues that are generated and using it towards public health and towards treating some of the health issues that arise from gambling disorders.
So you used the term also licensing and made reference to that. Would you assume that there will be a licensing mechanism in Maryland once we get to that stage, maybe even similar to what's happened with cannabis, and that is that there's some licensing agency and there's a licensing process, et cetera, to occur here? So with what you've experienced, especially in the District of Columbia, how long has it taken to do something like that, for instance?
Yes, licensing is going to be a key aspect of it, and it's going to be a highly scrutinized industry. This is not going down to the DMV and getting a learner's permit. The licensing process is going to be very intensive. There's going to be extensive vetting of potential licensees, similar to what was going on in the cannabis industry. It will take probably 6 months to a year, at least on the DC side. That's what we're anticipating for licenses to be issued. It requires extensive background checks, extensive proof of capital necessary to ensure that all bets can be paid, a large amount of vetting for any sort of whiff of criminal activity, and proof that you plan to actually address any of the issues that can arise from the legalization of sports betting, as we discussed. Overall, it is going to be a highly regulated industry, and like any industry that has been illegal for almost a century and is just becoming legalized, it's going to be highly scrutinized both by the government and I think by the press and the public at large. So it's going to take a lot of organization, a lot of compliance to make sure that you get licensed and you stay licensed.
So it sounds like, when you talk about the licensing, when you talk about operation itself, when you talk about the security and the medical people and the auditing and the marketing and all of the elements that are associated with gaming, if someone in Maryland, for instance, is interested in being involved in this industry, would it be wise for them to start today to reach out to Ian Thomas to say, will you help me with licensing, help me put together the educational plan, or help me, work my way into the gaming arena because I'm in security or have the medical qualifications?
Absolutely. So the fact that DC, West Virginia, and Delaware have already gone live means that there are still opportunities for Maryland businesses to get involved in sports gaming, just unfortunately outside of the state itself. But that being said, you are free to offer your services in these other jurisdictions, and I certainly can help in providing access to to the industry and to opportunities in those various jurisdictions. Beyond that, I think it's important to realize that this will happen in Maryland. I don't think there's any question about if. The question is really about when, and when that constitutional problem that we discussed can get resolved. The key, I think, will be getting first to market in Maryland. There are many, unlike DC, Maryland has some brick and mortar casinos already that will probably be ready to implement sports wagering as soon as it becomes legal. And for people who are looking to break into the industry, I don't think there is ever a time too soon to start planning and to start learning from the licensing processes that have been in existence in the District of Columbia, Delaware, and West Virginia, and to start planning and putting stuff together so that when the time comes, and it will come, you're ready to go and hit the ground running.
So the last thing, which we haven't talked about, but you did talk about earlier in your presentation, was the role of technology and what this is going to look like. You mentioned brick and mortar, and we can talk about the casinos that we have in the state. What do you see this being an item that has as borders brick and mortar, or is it going to be beyond that?
It's absolutely going to be beyond it. We're talking about 21st century sports wagering. We're not talking about a trip down to the OTB and placing a bet and getting a physical ticket. I mean, certainly that will exist, but sports books that are opening up are developing their own apps that can be used mobilely. There are definitely regulations that are being placed on those applications. For example, in DC, every sports book that creates its own application has to geofence it, meaning that the application cannot function outside of a designated physical space. But there will be a lot of room for tech companies to both develop and maintain apps, as well as geofence them to make sure that they only work in certain designations. In addition, various local government, or various state governments, I should say, are themselves offering applications that can be used for sports wagering. For example, the District of Columbia Lottery is planning on putting out a sports wagering app that will work within the District of Columbia and will allow people to place wagers from their mobile phone pretty much anywhere they go. So this is becoming a 21st century industry, and like every other 21st century industry, there's a lot of room for disruption, and there's a lot of room for tech companies to come in and find ways to address various issues that exist within the industry.
Well, you gave a fabulous presentation. It's an exciting subject. It's one that I agree with you. Maryland has got to get on board with. It's just too much money to leave on the table.
Absolutely.
And to have the casinos that we have and that infrastructure in place.
We're talking about funding schools, funding municipal projects. There's the thing about sports gambling that I don't think people recognize is that it is going to happen no matter what. As we started out discussing, $180 billion per year is illegally wagered. Imagine if that was actually captured by the local states and you're able to tax that revenue, get money in the municipal coffers, and use it on public projects that are important to us, schools, roads, all sorts of different types of development projects. It can be a huge benefit to the public at large, and I hope Maryland gets on board with it very soon.
We just have to deal with that Constitution.
That's right, that pesky Constitution.
That pesky Constitution. Ian Thomas, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.